wherever we were, and we likewise would visit them.
Sure. You know, let me just point out to the audience that KDKA has a tremendous history behind it. I believe it's the first radio station, is that correct?
First one, yeah.
Sure. And they were the first to do, obviously, election results and things like that. And they had a long reputation right from, you know, the 1920s, obviously.
That's right.
So this was a big deal to get there. But you were at a lot of stations with that were really big stations. Let's talk about your rise through the ranks, I guess you could say. You were at KDKA, but before that you were at a tiny station, is that correct?
Oh, yeah. I started out WOHI in East Liverpool, a 5,000 watt station. No, it was 250 watt station.
Sure.
And then I got a big break. I got to Zanesville, and Zanesville at WHIZ was a good radio station, but they were going on with television. Now, I didn't know that it was UHF television. There were only 3 UHF television stations on the air. We were the third in the whole country. And, you know, nobody had antennas that you could pick up the UHF signal. So when I did the first newscast on WHIZ television in Zanesville, probably the police radio had a bigger audience. You know, more people were listening in the studio than they were out there.
But, you know, you didn't get discouraged. That's a great thing. And you end up in Cleveland at, well, at WERE and KYW. Which one came first?
Yeah, WERE.
Okay, sure.
And and I was very, I got hired at WERE. I started right after January 1st. I started on January 2nd in 1959. And they had hired a fellow by the name of Bill Jorgensen. Remember him?
Sure, yeah.
Big anchor man, ended up at KYW. And then, but within a very few months, within 6 months, I was named news director. And we really had a wonderful news staff. And we started winning all the awards and so forth. KYW always wanted to be the leader in news.
Sure.
And they didn't like WERE doing what it was doing, and they hired me away from ERE to become news director at KYW.
We should also keep in mind that WERE was 5,000 watts.
Yes.
And KYW was 50,000, and you could hear it in Florida.
That's right.
So they obviously wanted the best people there. Just before we go on to KYW, where you did some truly remarkable things, we were talking about WERE, and I believe it was a gentleman named Miller owned it. Is that correct?
Ray Miller.
Ray Miller, who was the head of the Democratic Party, I believe.
That's right, of Cuyahoga County. Ray T. Miller.
Yeah, a very powerful man, too.
Oh, very powerful.
Sure.
And, you know, when during the Kennedy campaign, the Kennedy-Nixon campaign, if you remember, Eisenhower stayed out of the campaign until the very end.
Yeah.
And he finally decided that he would make, I don't know, 5 or 6 appearances around the country in big cities for Nixon. And Cleveland was one of them. So when he came, I had all the newsmen, all except Ray Tannehill was my nighttime anchor, who later became a big anchor man on KDK television in Pittsburgh. But Ray was back at the studio. The rest of us were in a suite down at the Sheraton Hotel overlooking Public Square. And we were lined, we had reporters from Lakefront Airport all the way to the square, and you know, thousands of people lined the streets for Ike. Well, I get a call from Ray Tannehill, the anchorman, and said, Ray Miller has called and said he stopped saying about how large the crowd was. It was a mediocre crowd.
Really?
And I did not tell anyone. I didn't say anything, but I just ignored it.
Sure.
But later on, I did call the staff together that night and say, I didn't know whether the next day I would be fired or not. And I told them what had happened. Well, I had to go back to the studio, get the tape edited, because we were just one of the very first clients of a company called Radio Press International. And that was an audio service for radio. That's how it all started. And, you know, they distributed those tapes then around the country by phone line to stations that were clients. And I had to get back and edit the Ike tape. Well, Bill Jorgensen and the rest of the fellows stopped in a bar on the way back to the studio and composed a telegram to WIND in Chicago, owned by Westinghouse. Westinghouse just bought that. And they were looking for newsmen. And they said, offered an entire news department with the best news director ever. And I didn't know this. And they sent that telegram to the manager of WIND. Well, he thought, he didn't know what to think when he got that telegram. He sent it to the vice president of programming of Westinghouse Broadcasting Company in New York, and I get a call from the vice president.
Wow.
That's how I got to KYW.
Oh, amazing. Well, you know, before we go to KYW, and I just want to point out to the audience here, that the name of the book is Out of Sight, Blind and Doing All Right, by our guest, Art Schreiber, who has amazing stories in and out of the book. One of the stories that I met up with a guy a few years ago, and I was at WERE for a number of years, and I met up with a guy, a very prominent name, and I asked him, is this your first time in Cleveland? And he says, no, I used to work at WERE. His job was to stand between Bob Neal and Jimmy Dudley on the road so they didn't get into a fist fight.
Yes.
And he said, you know, there was really no future in that, so after one season, he moved on. He was hired as a favor to Adlai Stevenson by Ray Miller. It was McLean Stevenson, the actor.
Oh,
and he says, I've had enough of this stupid radio thing. I'm going out to try my hand at acting. But at any rate, you knew Dudley and Neal, and they didn't like each other.
No, no. They, you know, when one would be in the booth doing a play-by-play, the other would not sit in the booth.
Yeah.
Neither one would sit with the other one. They never talked to one another.
They didn't want to breathe the same air as the other person.
Neal would say to me, tell him, and he never said his name. Tell him, and then he would tell me what he wanted me to tell him. And Dudley would do the same to me. Tell him. And I was the go-between when I was at WERE.
Do we know what it was all about? What was the dispute?
I could never figure out what it was. I asked Bob Neal, I've asked Jimmy Dudley, and never learned what the problem was.
To show you the extent of this and how everybody knew it, they were seen speaking to each other once, and it made headlines. I mean, it was actually in the Cleveland News where they said, did Jimmy Dudley and Bob Neal bury the hatchet? Then they actually were at, one of them was at a city club or something and mentioned it. A few days later, they were back at each other's throats. That was the end of it. So apparently,
you know, while at ERE, though, a wonderful thing occurred. We had a wonderful chief engineer, and now I'm forgetting his name.
Is it Satterwhite, maybe?
Terry Williams would know that name in a moment.
Okay.
But he was the best chief engineer I ever worked with in the whole business. Well, he developed the first wireless microphone.
Tell us about that. That's amazing.
And Ernie Simon, the WERE, had hired Ernie Simon. He was a wonderful jock out of Chicago. And they hired Ernie. In fact, his son is Scott Simon that works for NPR.
Oh, really?
Radio.
Okay.
And so the unfortunate part was Ernie was an alcoholic, and Scott Simon has talked about his father and his drinking problems. And he would fill an Orange Crush drink. He'd get out of the pop machine an Orange Crush and just take about 3 slugs and almost drain the bottle and fill the rest up with vodka.
Yeah.
And he'd do that several times during his morning show. Oh, boy. But he was a fabulous talent. And he came to me one day and he said, I'm going to, this is on his own radio show, in the morning show on ERE. He said, I'm going down to the stadium with this wireless mic, and so you fill in for me from the studio. I'll be talking to you on the wireless mic. So we did, and suddenly he's now in the stadium, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, here is a first. And you hear a toilet flush, and he's in the men's room flushing a toilet. He said, that's the first toilet flush you've ever heard on Cleveland radio.
And brought to you by the magic of technology. Yeah, Terry tells us that the engineer's name was Harry Dennis?
Harry Dennis.
That's it, sure.
Wonderful man.
Yeah, they were the real wizards, too. You know, one other thing happened with you and the Browns. You were actually working with the Browns, but you had to kind of keep that secret.
Well, what happened was, this really goes back when I was in Zanesville.
Oh, I see, okay.
We hired a sportsman by the name of Gib Shanley.
Oh,
and Gib Shanley worked with me in Zanesville. And in fact, Gib Shanley even got a job teaching speech and radio production at Muskingum College, a college that John Glenn made famous.
Sure.
And then when Gib left for Pontiac, Michigan, he asked me to take over as his teaching, and they approved me, and I did, and I taught there for 5 years. Now I came to Cleveland. And Gib and I stayed in touch all this time. By this time now, Gib was in Toledo as a sports reporter and anchor person on radio. And he called me up. Now I just arrived at WERE, and he called me up and he said, McColgan is leaving the Browns. He said, if you can help me, I'd appreciate it. I'm going to send a tape to WGAR. So they carried the Browns. Well, because I taught at Muskingum, Carl George was the manager of WGAR, but he was on the board of trustees of Muskingum College. And I had gotten to know him when I was in Zanesville, teaching at Muskingum. So I called Carl George and said, look, you're going to get 250 tapes for a Browns job, but you're going to get one from Gib Shanley, and I'm telling you, please hire him. And Carl George, I don't know that he did because I asked, but he hired Gib Shanley.
That's amazing.
And Gib moved in 2 houses or 3 houses from me in Parma Heights, and he said, you're going to be my statistician. Well, I said, Gib, I can't do that. KYW will. He said, well, then change your name.
Oh, okay.
And I changed my name to my father-in-law's name, Wally Vogel.
Is that right?
And my father-in-law would listen to KYW in Cleveland, in Pittsburgh. He could hear it. And everybody would say to him, hey, I hear a Wally Vogel on the Browns broadcast. Is that you? and he was so proud that his son-in-law was using his name.
Maybe it wasn't so bad when they came up that driveway and saw you sitting on the stoop there. So. The funny thing about Gib Shanley is he had a very good relationship with the owners, obviously, and Art Modell.
Yeah.
But Art Modell fired him one day when he heard him on the radio. He said that the Browns are doing terribly, and Art Modell was not very happy about it either. And Gib Shanley happened to mention at halftime, well, this is the first time that the Browns are going back to their locker room. It's the first time they've crossed midfield the whole game. And he fired him, but he was so popular they had to bring him back.
Yeah. Well, I got to know Art very well through Gib.
Sure.
And he would always talk about that time that he heard that, and he was so outraged that he said, I fired him because I couldn't help it.
Yes. Well, KYW, you talk about KYW in your book. Once again, for the folks out there, you must get this book, Out of Sight, Blind and Doing All Right by Art Schreiber, a remarkable book. And when you get to KYW, you hit the big time. You were already
Yes.
on the big time at KDKA, so you're now on KYW, which is heard in 38 states.
Yes. Well, of course, I was never on KDK except